Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on electrifying heavy-duty vehicles. We're really glad you can all join us, and we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Anna van der Spek, and I am the Electric Vehicle Program Director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. For those of you who might not be familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization based in Boston and Providence, with a mission to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low-carbon future. And we do that by both running programs and services that directly help consumers access clean energy technologies, and by taking the learnings that we gain running those programs to inform policy advocacy work that we do at the state and local level in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Some quick logistics for today's webinar. Everybody is muted to avoid background noise, but we absolutely encourage your engagement in this webinar. So please go ahead and write questions into the chat as they pop up. We'll have a long session of Q&A to make sure that we get to as many of your questions as possible. And then finally, this webinar is recorded. So stay tuned. Later this week, you'll get an email from me with the webinar recording and the slides and some other links you might find interesting. So there's no need to furiously take notes today. You'll get it all in your email. And with that, we'll go right ahead. This webinar is broken up into roughly 5 sessions or sections. First, we'll talk about why electrifying heavy-duty vehicles is so important, and then we'll hear from our 2 esteemed speakers today, Angie Gompert from Martha's Vineyard Transit Authority, which is now running a fleet of buses, of which half are electric, and Ezekiel Wheeler, the owner of Intelligent Labor and Moving, which is operating the first electric box truck in Massachusetts. So both will speak to their experience actually operating these vehicles on the ground. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A, and then at the very end, I'll wrap it up with some resources for fleet operators who might be interested in getting an electric heavy-duty vehicle, and an action alert for folks in Massachusetts and Rhode Island who want to engage and help support electrification. So with that, I'll move straight into why electric vehicles, and spoiler alert, the answer is that diesel is terrible. But we'll go into that in a little bit more specifics. So the first thing that you should know is that diesel has a really outsized impact in terms of climate and public health. So this is data from the Union of Concerned Scientists and MJ Bradley, and they found that in Massachusetts, medium and heavy-duty vehicles make up only 7% of the vehicles on our roads, but in terms of their share of transportation sector emissions, they're responsible for 20% of those greenhouse gas emissions, 46% of NOx emissions, those are nitrogen oxides, and 40% of PM emissions, and PM is particulate matter. Those last 2 categories are the local air pollution that has the biggest impact on public health. NOx and PM both exacerbate lung conditions like asthma and emphysema, but the body of science is really growing that shows how much they impact other bodily systems and organs. So there's very clear links between these kinds of emissions and heart problems and brain problems. And the list just keeps growing. So what this data shows us is that focusing on this sort of small sliver of the transportation pie can have an outsized impact in terms of both climate warming emissions and the types of emissions that harm human health. Unsurprisingly, that burden is not equally distributed across the Commonwealth. On the left, we have a map, again, from the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows diesel PM emissions, so that's that particulate matter. And the areas on the map where it's a darker red are the places where diesel emissions are worse. And on the right, we have a map from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health that shows us the prevalence of asthma among adults. So on that map where it's a darker blue, asthma is worse. And you can see when the maps are side by side that there are very clear points of overlap. So Springfield, for example, is known as the asthma capital of the country. It has some of the highest rates of asthma in the entire US, and you can see that in both maps it's a heavy point for diesel emissions and for asthma. The same is true for Greater Boston and New Bedford, but if you look even more closely, the overlap just continues. So if you look at Lowell and Worcester and Brockton and other cities across the state, the link between diesel PM emissions and asthma is really clear. This unequal distribution is not just geographic, it is racial as well. This is a graphic from, again, the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows the population-weighted exposure to PM 2.5, which is just particulate matter of a particular size, in Massachusetts. And it breaks down different racial groups relative to the Massachusetts average. So what this graph shows us is that Asian American residents of Massachusetts have a 27% higher exposure to particulate matter than the state average. African American residents have a 24% higher exposure, and Latino residents or Latinx residents have a 17% higher exposure than the state average. And on the other end of the graphic, we can see that white residents have a 7% lower exposure to PM pollution in Massachusetts. So this data makes it really clear that cleaning up trucks and buses is a matter of racial equity as well. So far, everything that I've talked about has been about the societal or social benefits of electrifying heavy-duty vehicles. But of course, there is the operator side as well. And the good news is that there are really clear benefits to operators switching from diesel-powered heavy-duty vehicles to electric ones. And that is why we're so glad to have Angie and Ezekiel with us today. And I'll shortly turn the mic over to them. But one sort of quick overview of these benefits is that, like just as electric passenger vehicles have fewer moving parts than gas-powered cars, electric heavy-duty vehicles also have fewer parts, and that translates into lower maintenance costs over the lifetime of the vehicle. Electricity prices are also lower and more stable than diesel prices, which means it's much easier for a fleet operator to predict out an operating budget over several years. Electric trucks and buses have no tailpipe emissions, which means operators don't have to deal with really complicated diesel regulations and reporting that take up a lot of time and resources. The trucks and buses are quieter and less polluting, which means drivers and, in the cases of buses, passengers are happier. And there's also less time spent refueling, which means that the drivers of these vehicles are quite pleased to not have to spend as long next to a smelly diesel pump. So that's a sort of brief overview, but I will now turn the virtual mic over to Angie from Martha's Vineyard Transit Authority to talk about their experience a little bit. Angie, are you there? Oh, hold on, you're muted, but now you should not be muted. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Anna. Appreciate it. My name is Angie Gompert. I'm the administrator of the Martha's Vineyard Transit Authority, and we're an island off the coast of Massachusetts. The island is about 90 square miles, and we run service through all 6 towns on the island. We have 12 routes that operate year-round, and in the summer, pre-pandemic, we were providing about 1.4 million rides annually, and traveled about 1.2 million revenue miles annually for fixed route service. Our fleet makeup is currently 32 buses, 30-foot, 35, and 40-foot buses, and 16 of those are all battery electric in all 3 sizes. Next slide, please. The VTA's vision for public transit on the island came into play back in 2016 when we decided to do an alternative fuels assessment. And through the assessment, basically the recommendation was to stick with diesel, but try some pilot programs for electric. That wasn't really what I had in mind, and we weren't being successful with diesel here on the island. So we really put our heads down and decided to transition our entire fleet to all electric. So we have, in the picture above, when we had our ribbon cutting ceremony, you can see one of our 35-foot battery electric buses in the background. We recently converted all of our relief cars to all electric Nissan Leafs and Hyundai Konas. We had planned on from the get-go that we were going to do plug-in chargers at our operations and maintenance center, 1 charger per bus, as well as planning for inductive charging en route to eliminate the range issue that we were definitely going to have. And on site, we wanted to be fully independent, if you will, from the grid when we needed to be. So we wanted to be able to generate our own power. So we have installed 8 solar canopies and battery storage units. Next slide, please. Our progress to date is we have the 16 buses running, and they're running pretty well, all things considered. Our operations maintenance center is fully ready to complete our build out for all chargers for all vehicles. We have 16 chargers installed right now, and we have level 2 chargers for our relief cars. Our next phase will be putting in some level 3 charging as we expand into fleet replacement with our paratransit vans and minibuses. We have contracted with Momentum Dynamics to put inductive charging units en route and started construction on our first en route inductive charging site in Edgartown. All of 16 of the buses are equipped now with inductive charging pads as well. The 8 solar canopies that we did install generate about 700 kilowatts of electricity, and we also have installed and are operating our own microgrid so that we can run grid parallel for charging and also run grid independent if we need to break free from the grid for various reasons. Our battery storage project was really the piece of the puzzle that will allow us to completely be grid independent. We have installed about 1,440 kilowatt hours of battery storage at our bus operations center. And what that does is it strengthens our transit operations. It provides operational flexibility, resiliency, and it allows us to store our own renewable energy that we generate on site. We have seen demand response savings from using the battery storage units as well. And it also just increases the distribution of our overall efficiency when charging all of the fleet at the same time. The battery storage units are from NEC. Unfortunately, NEC is no longer in business in the United States, though they still support those battery storage units, but we have 3 batteries here that combined make up that 1,440 kilowatt hours. And that definitely is something we'll talk about later on with challenges. Here's a nice picture of our solar canopies. And as you can see in the lower picture, we have the charging stations and the buses parked underneath the solar canopies. For those that might have some interest, we had our first snowstorm a couple weeks ago. And oddly enough, we didn't get much snow underneath the canopies the way that storm hit. So plowing was not an issue for us so far with having solar canopies and the parking underneath. So this is kind of the overview of the microgrid controls. The microgrid controller company that we selected was PICE. And what it does is it allows the battery storage unit, it's basically the brain of the entire operation. It can decide how we're going to charge, whether it be straight from grid to bus, grid to battery, solar to battery, solar to bus, and then when all else fails, a diesel generator as a backup if we need to. Our solar provider for the project is NLX. NLX bought our project from Borrego Solar, who was the solar developer, and we now have a 20-year purchase power agreement with NLX so that we know the cost of every kilowatt of electricity that we spend and what that will be going forward for the next 20 years, which is a really good budgeting tool for a transit agency to have. As with transitioning any fleet, we definitely have come across our fair share of challenges. One of the ones that is on the transit end is that the industry is moving quickly and some of our partners are still playing catch up to the game. An example of this is often those of us in the transit world apply for federal competitive grants, and if we're using any federal funding, we have to meet the Buy America requirements. And currently there's no battery storage vendor that meets the Buy America requirements. NEC did not meet those requirements, so we ended up having to divert some state funding to purchase the batteries and also received a grant for that. Some of the grant requirements that we have received, the grant programs are great, but for a small organization like us, some of the requirements have been challenging to keep up with. And some of them are like the cart before the horse, and in particular, the safety plan was for the battery storage unit that was run through Mass Clean Energy Center. Some of the stuff they were asking for, we wouldn't have known yet because we hadn't commissioned the batteries, but they wanted the safety plan before we got to commissioning. So there was some really true process challenges there. And also for anybody that's in a small public type organization, the coordination with the partners and the various system components is a real heavy lift for an organization of our size. Fortunately, the industry, the energy industry has really stepped up, and now you don't have to do things quite as hard and individually as we did, because we procured the solar, we procured the buses, we procured the battery storage units, we procured the technical assistance, and then we oversaw that whole process. So now there is models that have come out of the fleet electrifications that are going across the country, and energy as a service model is something that I would definitely consider and recommend others consider now, because the coordination of the partners and the system components is done as part of those types of agreements. The other big challenge for us is that we didn't move off-site. Like, we had to work within the confines of our existing property to be able to still run transit operations 363 days a year while building a major construction project along the perimeter and converting our fleet and running service 363 days a year. And then obviously, I'm sure everybody has heard that the utilities are much slower to than they should be, honestly, at this point, in terms of being able to come back with information and helping us on their end with our fleet electrification. So the interconnection process really needs to be improved because you get lost sometimes in the utility vacuum. Technical challenges and opportunities, design considerations for bus operations and phasing of whatever type of fleet you're looking at. But the nice part about electric vehicles is that they're programmable. You can program in your acceleration rate, your top speed, geofence certain trouble areas where you might have speeding vehicles. You can really limit those types of things. And another big design consideration is your specific site. For us, we're in the airport business park, and so we are not able to have as much solar as we would have liked, because we would have been blinding the tower, and that FAA looks poorly on that. We want all the planes to land. The battery procurement was also another technical challenge for us. The battery market is really far behind, and I contend that if there's a battery vendor that really gets up to speed quickly with what the existing requirements are for using federal funds for transit agencies, certainly they'll get a lot further. It's confusing to the battery folks because they might already have a contract, and most of them do, with the Department of Defense or something. So they're like, well, why can't we just use the same battery? And it's a valid question, but that's not how our procurement guidelines are written in the rules that we have to follow. So, and with the battery, obviously in our case, with the vendor going out of business, that created a huge nightmare for us that we're still working through. The other big one is software. So you have so many different options for software and telematics. We have bus telematics, so we can see the state of charge of every bus that is on the road. when we start charging inductively on the road, we'll be able to see how the buses are performing and how much energy they're getting off of their charging while they're on the route. But what you don't realize with all of this equipment, or at least certainly I didn't at the beginning, was how much of this equipment that we have that has not only a hardware potential for update, but also software updates. And so if those are not well broadcast, and if they're not well known ahead of time, sometimes they can get out of sync and that can be problematic. So you want to make sure that your software components are in the software within all of your subcomponents are working well together, which is just another challenge. Luckily, I have a technical team that worries about that a lot more than I do. Some broad lessons learned is strong partnerships are key, and you need a leader to keep your project on task. Any type of fleet transition, whether you're doing from diesel to diesel hybrid, to CNG to electric, and some of us have even looked at propane, you need a champion and you need a leader to forward your project. It's going to be met with resistance. Those of us that are in transit or do transportation in general, we generally like to, we know what we like, and we know our product, and we learn to work around those issues. We did it all, we all had to do that when clean diesel and DEF came into our worlds. It's just doing it again with a different fuel type for changing to electrification. Thoughtful phasing of the project is essential to ensure continuity of operations. In some cases, it would have been useful to have some of our partners understand all aspects versus their piece of the puzzle. And that's definitely one that I would try to keep like a message board going as we work on some of our lessons learned that we're working on, because it is harder for them to understand, especially the microgrid piece, because that one is so different than kind of the rubber on the road, so to speak. And definitely you need fortitude. You're going to run into problems. There's no doubt about it. So you just have to be able to stay the course and see it through to the end. And as it comes to the partners, I've decided that it would be useful to help understand the partners that we did have. So Eversource was our utility partner, Mass Clean Energy Center with grant support for our battery storage units. Mass DOT in Massachusetts provides a significant amount of funding for regional transit authorities. And Federal Transit Administration, we got 4 years of no-low grants, competitive no-low grants for making our infrastructure come together. And our technical partners and our construction partners is this group. So Borrego Solar was the solar developer and installer. BYD, which stands for Build Your Dreams, is our electric bus manufacturer. One of the reasons we selected BYD was because they offered 30, 35, and 40-foot buses. And for our system, we need that on the island due to our road network. And the BYD buses are also AC, so it allows us initially to have more flexibility and, you know, vehicle to grid, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to building, etc. Going forward. And LX is the company that financed our PV system, and that's who our purchase power agreement is with. And our batteries are enrolled in the Clean Peak program, which also reduced our PPA by about a penny per kilowatt hour over 20 years. That's a good chunk of change right now. It won't probably last that long, depending on when the Clean Peak program comes out, but no longer exists. Momentum Dynamics is the inductive charging vendor. NEC is our battery storage vendor, and PICE is the microgrid controller that controls all of the pieces, the bus chargers, the generator, the battery storage units, the PV, and they optimize all of our stuff to make sure that we're getting the best pricing that we can. And we can also do demand response and send out the energy that's in our battery storage units to get some revenue in as well. And then our technical team is made up of Vermont Energy Investment Corp. They help us with grant writing as well as technical assistance. ARUP is the electrical engineering firm that is the subcontractor, and locally we use South Mountain to make sure we are procuring the right type of PV, and they helped oversee the project locally because they're on the island.
Well, thank you very much for that tour of force through electrifying the buses on Martha's Vineyard. There are a ton of questions in the chat already, but what I'm going to do is pass the virtual mic to Ezekiel now to talk a little bit about intelligent labor and moving, and then we can all come back together for questions at the end. So Ezekiel, take it away.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm Ezekiel Wheeler from Intelligent Labor and Moving. We've been in business since 2005. Currently, we own 6 trucks ranging from small box trucks like the one pictured up to tractor trailer, and we employ between 10 and 15 people. We're located in and own our own warehouse in Arlington, Massachusetts. So about the truck, in March of 2020, the Truck More EV program opened, and we signed up for 2 vouchers. We were granted those vouchers and simultaneously put in an order for our truck for one truck with SEA Electric. We received vouchers number 1 and 2, so we were the first to get our vouchers granted. The truck was delivered on August 19th of 2020. We had it registered and inspected by the 23rd and out working for customers on the 24th. We were the first to redeem a More EV voucher and therefore likely the first electric commercial truck in Massachusetts. As far as I can tell, it's the first and only fully electric moving truck, full stop. Through what series of events did we find ourselves owners of the first electric moving truck? Aside from an upbringing that stressed certain values, I would say that being a mover has informed my views. Moving at its core is about the preservation of condition of those things of which you've been entrusted. It's not hard to see that our planet has been entrusted to us and we should preserve its condition. But also on a practical level, moving is about maintaining a sustainable pace. During a typical day of moving, I might climb up to 100 flights of stairs or have tens of thousands of steps. And if you don't have a sustainable pace, you're not going to get it done. And you don't go home when you're tired. You go home after you've loaded the truck and unloaded truck. So it's more about the scope of work than about how you feel about it. So maintaining a sustainable, realistic pace and putting together plans that work are core to what we do, even on an individual carrying a cardboard box level. And those drove my thinking getting into sustainability projects. But I've also found that sustainability projects tend to pay for themselves and have a finite return on investment. And so as I've proceeded with those, each one partially at least pays for the next. And so when we got our first solar panels, they started paying themselves back almost immediately. And then an air source heat pump, electric car, some more solar panels, another electric car, a ground source heat pump, an electric truck, some more panels, because they keep buying panels. And then we have another electric truck on order currently. Solar also allows me, and solar is integral to the concept here. Solar allows me to live and work without paying the same folks that are out there working to damage our planet and increase inequality. And I like to call that freedom from self-destruction, which is nice. But all these projects need to actually work and pay for themselves, or I'll just run myself out of business trying to be a nice guy. So let's take a look at that and how this truck functions and actually makes money. We're on a different slide than I expected. And if we give us the picture with the warehouse with the solar panels on it and the truck next to it. There we go. On the left is a picture of our warehouse. On the right is a picture of the electric truck. As you can see, we have solar panels on the roof of the warehouse. Since that picture was taken, we've doubled them. Solar is a key part of what makes the electric truck math work, but I'll get sort of into the details of that later. One of the key considerations when considering electric truck is the application. The range of electric trucks currently is around 100 to 200 miles, and the charging rate is not fast enough where you can go charge the truck while you're getting lunch at a truck stop. So it's too slow for en route charging. So you need to keep your daily distance to 100 miles or less to be safe. And you need trucks that return to their terminal every night for overnight charging. Local moving is perfect for this. In planning the purchase, we examined the mileage of the 2 trucks which we'd be replacing. And for the first 9 months of 2019, they didn't do more than 80 miles a day if they were working in state. So perfect for the application. For local work, we always return to terminal by 7 p.m. as we have a noise ordinance, so the nighttime charging is not a problem for us. The truck's drivetrain is made by a company called SEA Electric. They're an Australian company with an office in the United States. Most of their installed running equipment is in Australia, and domestically, most of their equipment is in California. I believe in North America, their fleet numbers in the dozens. They're a little cagey when I ask them, but I know there's a fair number of them in California and some in New York. It really follows the incentives. The drivetrain that they make is then installed into a glider, which is a truck that's been manufactured without a drivetrain. The glider is a Hino 195 chassis. Hino is the truck division of Toyota, who you may have heard of. The gross vehicle weight is 19,500 pounds. That's the most it can weigh and still be legal to drive down the road. The empty weight or tear is 11,080 pounds. Anna, can I have the next slide with the truck stats, I believe? Perfect. So yeah, as you can see, tear of 1180. Gross vehicle weight is 19,500. The gross vehicle weight factors in not just how much you can transport, but also determines whether it's a CDL truck, and this truck is not, which factors into the cost of the driver, et cetera. It also factors into how much incentive you get from the More EV program. Given the equipment available for purchase, my needs for a local truck, and all the incentives, I found the 19.5 weight class to be the sort of sweet spot for me, but I also believe it's the sort of sweet spot within the program, given battery vehicle cost, battery availability, and incentive size. I can go into sort of detail on the incentives and the weight classes later if people are interested. Next slide, please. The truck has a 138 kilowatt hour battery pack. For comparison, a Tesla Model 3 has a 75 kilowatt hour pack. E-Golf 36, Porsche Taycan 80 or 90, other Teslas somewhere in that range. The battery size can be considered to be twice the size of a Tesla Model 3 to compare it to a vehicle that you've probably seen driving around, because unless you've seen mine, you've not seen one of these. So the Model 3 does 4 miles per kilowatt. The truck does 1 mile per kilowatt. So it has twice the battery, but 4 times the consumption, which gives it about half the range of those Model 3 long ranges you see driving around. Trucks with shorter bodies, lower overhead height, will be more aerodynamic. So a flatbed, for example, would get much better fuel mileage when empty than our truck, which would give it a longer range. For our application, maximum cubic footage was what we were looking for, and the range gains or losses weren't material to us for most of our routes. Our truck does not have DC fast charging, but an upgrade is available to get it to 100 kilowatt. Our next truck will have that. We currently charge on a level 2 charger. We have a 40 amp charger, or a couple 40 amp chargers and an 80 amp charger, depending on what parking spot the truck is in. From 0 to full, it'll typically take 6 to 12 hours, depending upon the charger. We rarely charge it that much. We only brought it back at 1% once, which is a little scary, but it made it. We haven't run out of batteries yet. Our charging infrastructure didn't require anything special from the utility. Our 200 amp panel that we already had with the warehouse was fine. We didn't have so many loads, we couldn't add a bunch of chargers. And that's one of the advantages of this size of truck, is that it'll charge on essentially car infrastructure. You don't need to wait 5 years for the utility to come dig a massive hole in the neighborhood and put all sorts of transformers in for DC fast charging. May I have the next slide, please? I've compared the truck with an equivalent Isuzu NRR, which is the same weight class and currently available with a diesel engine. I've used some real rough ballpark numbers. This isn't a super in-depth analysis, just some basic napkin math to get the point across. For the sake of this example, I've assumed 1,000 miles per month, which is about right for us. Clearly, different applications will have different specific details. Next slide, please. Here's some basic math for the solar we're using, because that factors pretty importantly in. We recently installed a new system to power this truck and another truck that we have on order. Without digging too deeply into the details, at year 10, the cost for the system would be around $20,000. That doesn't factor in the cost of electricity, so it's $20,000, and then all your, or that much electricity that it will generate is free. So to fuel the truck for one electric truck for 10 years, it costs $10,000 for the solar. After 10 years, you still have warranty. It's all still viable, but for the purpose of math, I'm sort of limiting it to a 10-year discussion. So the fuel is 100% sunk cost, which is very different than the way we've looked at energy and fuel in the past. You've never been able to have fuel as sunk cost. So as you can see, if you're paying retail for electricity, the Hino slowly catches up with the diesel, the electric slowly catches up with the diesel. Even at 15 years and 180,000 miles, it's still a bit more expensive. Now, at that point, quite often the way these values are calculated is you look at then what is the sale price of that used truck, and then you can find a real total cost of ownership. But we don't know what an electric truck's going to be worth with 180,000 miles on it. So we can't really calculate that. If it's worth more, we could be at price parity at 15 years or not. We don't really know. So some companies will do 180,000 miles in half as much time as I would. Some longer, but we're pretty short range, so we're on the slower end of things. That would change the math to some degree, but this is just sort of for our use case. Not included in any of this cost benefit analysis is the time it takes to fuel, which you don't have anymore because it just does it itself while you're sleeping. Maintenance costs should be lower, but I didn't really factor them in because we don't really know, because no one's got a 180,000 mile electric truck. I would expect brakes to be cheaper, but having driven electric cars for 3 years, they do chew up tires a little faster. So there's some things to be learned. When you factor in controlling your electricity costs, that's when you see the real opportunity here. The ability to produce your own fuel at a steep discount means you achieve price parity before 10 years. I'd like to have shown a third column with leased solar, but I don't really have those numbers, and I've not tried it personally, so I don't want to speak to it. Solar also assumes you have control over your own terminal, its roof. It's not doable for every business, but for those of us who can, it presents some incredible opportunities for savings and controlling your long-term costs. You also need net metering, which we have in Massachusetts, or it won't work with the nighttime charging, daytime generation. Our warehouse is approximately 5,500 square feet. So with current technology, you could support 3 to 4 electric trucks with that size roof. Solar is the real game changer here. The combination of solar and electric trucks is it's pretty clever. May I please have the next slide? These are graphs of the consumption and calculated range from SEA's computers. This is actual graphs for our actual truck. Most of the time we're hovering around 1 kilowatt hour per mile. Highway speeds are worse. We get around 130 miles of range. If it's pure highway driving, local driving is better, closer to 150. We've been playing with the aerodynamics a bit. Annexing aerodynamic devices, I don't have real apples to apples numbers on that because the temperature's also been changing as we add them. So temperature, load size, driving style factor in, but the highway, non-highway is really the biggest driver of consumption. The worst range I've seen our truck put out was about 100 miles of range. That was with it 6 degrees out all day long, heat blaring, driving 65 miles. We knew we had a good route where we were going to make it back regardless, so we sort of tried to get the worst possible case, and that was on like a 75-mile trip, so it should be decent data. Next slide, please. Well, what went wrong? The company that shipped the truck, just the shipping company, damaged it, so we had to get some things fixed when it showed up, mostly just cosmetic stuff. The odometer cable was loose, and so the dash was a little flickery. SEA took care of all this, no cost to us, but it's on the list. It's a short list, so I felt I should have something on it. SEA uses as much of the stock Hino truck as possible, which is great. So if things need to get fixed, you can use local vendors and just call up Hino and have them deal with it. And parts availability will be good for all the non-SEA equipment. One of the things that they couldn't do was use the Hino power steering and power brake system, so they have their own electric pump installed. They had to adjust that a couple times to make it steer correctly, and then also later the pressure was high and it threw a blew a fuse, so it had to get towed once. That's the only time we've had to tow it. But since then, it's been relatively trouble-free. It has been trouble-free. There have been a number of events where the truck lost power en route. They had their tech guy come out. He's spent a week with the truck. We had to reproduce it with some data loggers hooked up, and they have a software update that's actually being installed in the truck right now. Their support's been amazing. Their guy Steve worked for other electric truck companies in the past before they're really sort of commercially viable, and they hired him, and he's been fantastic. Probably one of the best parts of the truck is actually the service that goes along with it. What hasn't gone wrong? Modern diesels have a lot of equipment bolted on them to make them pollute less. All of it makes the truck more complicated and run poorly, depending on the year and model. Some engines are better than others. Some engine manufacturers no longer sell engines in North America or Europe as a result. Emissions equipment has been a real problem for a lot of fleets since 2007 specifically, and electric does away with all of that. Diesels also have their own problems regardless of the emissions gear. Cold weather can cause diesel to gel. And some of the modern fine filters for engines really don't like the thicker fuel, so you got to use a lot of additive. Diesel fuel itself has changed over the years, and so it's a bit of a moving target. And there's a lot of little details to know and understand. The electrics are a lot simpler. So we've been happy with the truck. Our drivers like it. It's quiet. It's comfortable. There's no need to stop and fuel ever. It's always charged when you come into work. There's also some intangible elements to it. Being the only mover, for the guys that work for me, the only mover in the world driving an electric truck on any given day is kind of cool. Driving the Tesla of trucks is also kind of cool, according to the crew. Customers are pretty happy to see you, and instead of folks honking at you and giving you the finger for being large while in traffic, you get honks and thumbs up for being part of the solution, which is a nice change. I've had to answer a lot of questions about how and why and what if, but those are all answerable questions. And so it's been pretty popular with my drivers and my workers. And we run it pretty much every day. I run it before any other piece of equipment if I have the option. That's the basics. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ezekiel, and I will invite Angie to come back up, and I will stop sharing my screen and go through some of the questions because we've had a fair number come through. Let me see here. So I have one question is more about the specifics of diesel and how the sort of touching on exactly what you were just talking about, Ezekiel, of the problems that you're not having because of diesel. And I have a specific question about the operational or other downsides of diesel. And I know, Angie, when we spoke before this webinar, you talked about having started in this world as an operator yourself and know firsthand how nasty that diesel engines are. And so I guess if you could both touch on that in a little bit more detail for folks who aren't fleet operators, that would be great.
Angie, you go first.
There we go. Yeah, so, this time of year, certainly gelling of fuel is definitely an issue that we're not seeing with the electric buses. And really for us, given our low speeds here on the island and given how much stop and go our system is, because we have a flag system here for transit, we were not successful running diesel just because of all of the sensors and all of the smart technology that are in vehicles now. And we didn't have our labor force here is also limited in terms of maintenance technicians. So we just did not have a lot of success running clean diesel with enhanced emissions. You also don't have turbos and PFs and all of that stuff that needs to be cleaned or replaced. We used to do, I would have a bus for 10 or 12 years and I never did injectors on it. And now we routinely do injectors on our diesels at less than 100,000 miles. So there's a much greater savings in terms of the cost of the electric, even though there's a bigger cost up front. The maintenance costs of the electric have gone down for us the best through, transition half of our fleet.
Yeah, I think one of the, particularly Angie and myself have the problem of being sort of low mileage, low speed. And a lot of diesel equipment at this point is really designed for highway operation. The emission equipment is specifically designed expecting the truck to spend piles of time at highway speeds going over 65 miles an hour. And so for an emissions control truck to work properly, it really needs to hit over 65 for a fair amount of the day. That's when it does what they call regens, where it maintains itself. Otherwise, you have to do parked regens, which are varying shades of awful, both to be the person that runs it and just to deal with it operationally. So it's really all designed for highway operation. So being a local operator, electric has even more advantages relative to highway. So if you're running highway all day, it's hard right now, or I would almost say impossible to run, like 800 miles a day, which is sort of like your technical maximum what you can do on hours of service in an electric truck. It's just not doable. But also running diesel at 30 miles a day, under 40 miles an hour all day, having run electrics almost feels impossible. Like why would you run a diesel in that set of circumstances? Because it's really not built for it. It doesn't work well in that application. And until now, you didn't have another choice except old equipment, which was better about it. Another factor of diesel that versus electric that I think is going to play out as time goes by is that there's a real shortage of technicians out there that can work on traditional diesel equipment with the modern emissions, because you have to have a combination of wanting to get greasy and bust your knuckles, and then also have to understand computers anyway, because they're all computer controlled, and you got to test all these sensors and understand these codes, etc. It's complicated, so it's a weird mix of desires and skills for the technicians that have to work on them. So there's a real shortage. And so driving down the frequency of maintenance and and splitting the types of maintenance into two groups, more greasy busted knuckle business, and then more like straight, I'm a computer guy and I'm wearing a tie kind of stuff, is going to help with finding the types of labor that will be able to maintain these vehicles in the long run. So I think electric has that advantage as well.
There's a series of questions here that are sort of asking how your investments and progress here has been received by either passengers on the buses or clients of Intelligent Labor and Moving. Like, what's the feedback that you've been getting from the public?
For us, it's been all very positive. We did have a couple of neighbors to the bus station that were, 2 blocks away, challenged the project for the inductive chargers to be installed. But that was primarily because our bus stops are in a historical district, and obviously electrical equipment isn't historic. But other than that, the projects have been received really well, because the other huge benefit of electric is noise. You don't have the vehicle idling when you're doing, loading or unloading a wheelchair, or accelerating out of, our zones are generally, our bus stops are right next to residence, where people live. So you're not accelerating out of there where they can hear that and really feel that, because the vibration, depending on what your fleet is, we have some internationals that are pretty noisy, as well as some Cummins in our fleet still, and you can really feel it as well as hear it. So and in the electric buses, we did some more passenger amenities. They can charge their phone on the bus, and it's just, they've been very well received.
Our customer response ranges from, oh, so that's an electric truck? Okay, well, you guys aren't going to break my stuff, right? So complete indifference, all the way to some people being very excited about it. As a sort of result, or in concert with electric trucks, we've been exploring ways to eliminate plastic from our moving as well. And so the reception of the electric truck in concert with that, the ability to hypothetically provide a petroleum-free move, is sort of a bigger claim, a bigger game changer. Being able to do those together, and it's required some figuring. So bring the two elements together under one flag has not been easy, but it's also, I think, delivering some bigger dividends for customers. It's not like they're, oh, well, you got an electric truck, but now we're going to use all this plastic to wrap the stuff, or, oh, hey, we don't use plastic, but we're still burning diesel. Being able to just say full stop, we're not doing any of that today. That really speaks to customers, and in a way where you can do it in an unqualified way, to say, oh, we have plastic, but we recycle it, and maybe, what percentage of the recycling actually gets done. I think a lot of people have lost faith in some of the some green initiatives, which is unfortunate. But be able to say we're just not, and the thing's powered by solar. It's right there. You can look at it, come down here anytime. I think really gives people a bit of a peace of mind. And to me, I think the important part with all these projects is to show that a path can be blazed, and that if we can do it at all, it should be easier the next time around. And then the time after that, it'll be even easier for whoever else comes along. And so I think that's pretty key. And I think some customers dig and some customers just don't care.
Well, I think that path blazing analogy is a great place to end this portion and get to the sort of wrap up of this, because you two are absolutely blazing the path, and the fact that you're here chatting with us today means that other people can learn from that, and that it will be easier for them when they do it compared to when you did it. So we are very grateful to you for A, doing the awesome stuff, and then B, talking to us about the awesome stuff. So I think if we were in an auditorium, people would be applauding now. So consider yourselves applauded. And I know that we're almost at 1, and I want to be respectful of people's time. So I will just do the final couple of slides that talk about resources that are available for fleets who want to electrify, and then a way for everybody else, even if you're not a fleet operator, to get engaged. So I will quickly run through those and then let you all go for lunch. So on the resources front, starting at the state level, Ezekiel mentioned More EV Truck. This is a carve-out, basically, of the state's program to electrify passenger vehicles. In April 2021, they set aside $10 million to focus on medium and heavy-duty vehicles. More EV Truck applies to vehicles that are over 8,500 pounds, and the incentive depends on the vehicle class, and it increases with weight. So the lightest of the medium duty vehicles, step vans, and full-size pickups, they qualify for $7,500, and then it goes all the way up to $90,000 for things like dump trucks and cement trucks. More EV Truck is set up with a block structure. So basically within each of these vehicle classes, there's a certain number of rebates that are allocated to certain blocks. And once a block is subscribed, folks who apply for rebates in the second block get a slightly smaller rebate. And so that structure is set up to hopefully incentivize early action. As Ezekiel mentioned, there are also vouchers available for vehicles over 14,000 pounds. So some of these vehicles are not readily or immediately available. So if you are a fleet operator looking to get an electric heavy-duty truck and you want to make sure that you can reserve the funding through More EV Truck, so that you can actually go ahead and order one of these vehicles, that is possible through this voucher structure. And then finally, More EV Truck is set up with an adder for vehicles that operate in environmental justice communities. So if a fleet operator can prove that they do operate in one of these environmental justice communities, the rebate that they can receive through more EV truck is 10% larger, which is the state's effort to really target those places where the burden of our reliance on diesel in trucks is felt most. The state does recognize that we need more right now than just rebates to really kickstart this space in Massachusetts. So the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center is about to launch a program called Mass Fleet Advisor, through which they will provide planning and advisory support for fleets in Massachusetts who want to consider electrifying. So in the first year of the program, which is this year, the program will provide high-level assessments of the value proposition and potential for greenhouse gas emission reductions to 65 fleets. And then of those 65, 15 will move on to get more detailed modeling analyses to help figure out an actual procurement strategy. And then of those 15, 5 will move on to actually receive procurement support, including mechanic and driver training, which I know we just heard is particularly important. So this program is launching in mid-February, but if you're interested, you can start reaching out now, and we will share information on how to do that in the follow-up email. I will touch on this briefly, but there are federal funding opportunities that complement those opportunities in the state. So Angie mentioned the Low and No Emission Vehicle Program. That's from the Federal Transit Administration, and it's basically a cost share program for state and local governments to purchase electric transit vehicles. There are other sub-grants within that program that we will send you a link to as well if you'd like to explore. But that one is for state and local governments specifically and for transit specifically. Meanwhile, the Environmental Protection Agency has the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act funding, which it can allocate towards projects that protect human health and reduce diesel emissions. There are basically 4 buckets that this funding can be used in. There's national grants, there's grants specific to tribal and insular areas, there's grants for school buses, and there's grants to states for states to then distribute further. So that is another route that projects can go if you're seeking funding to electrify heavy-duty vehicles. And then finally, we heard a lot about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that set aside $5 billion over the next 5 years for electric school and transit buses specifically. Basically, for fiscal years 2022 through 2026, each year there will be $500 million exclusively for electric school buses, and then $500 million for electric and alternative, which advocates hope will tilt heavily in favor of electric and move away from other alternatives, because that's mostly things like propane, which are still fossil fuels. Build Back Better would have put a whole other bucket of money behind this. In the latest version, there were $2 billion allocated for heavy-duty truck electrification. So, knock on wood, remains to be seen what comes out in that process, but there are lots of other ideas about how the federal government could support the electrification of medium and heavy-duty vehicles, which hopefully some of which will come to fruition through Build Back Better at some point. Moving on, it can be frustrating sitting here looking at the federal government trying to figure out how they're going to support vehicle electrification, but there are a couple of opportunities much closer to home that we wanted to make sure people are aware of. So there are 2 regulations coming out of California that both Massachusetts and Rhode Island are sort of poised to adopt. So California has the right to set stricter emissions standards than the federal government because of a waiver in the Clean Air Act, and then other states have the right to adopt California standards. So California has released these 2 regulations that will address heavy-duty vehicles. The first is called Advanced Clean Trucks, or ACT, and it basically requires manufacturers to sell an increasing number of zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles from 2024 to 2035. The sales target depends on the vehicle class, and there's also a portion in it about reporting to the state. But so far, 6 states have adopted ACT, and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, we think, should as well. The sort of complement to ACT is the heavy-duty omnibus rule, or the HDO. This one targets NOx emissions, and basically it strengthens those pesky regulations that Ezekiel and Angie were talking about in-use testing for new heavy-duty diesel vehicles. So ACT increases the percentage of electric trucks in the fleet, and HDO basically makes those diesel trucks that are still in the fleet cleaner while we wait for that percentage to increase. And so far, California and Oregon have adopted the HDO. The benefits of adopting these regulations are pretty extreme. The Union of Concerned Scientists took a look with MJ Bradley at the benefits of adopting these 2 regulations for Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And we pulled out the benefits here for Massachusetts. UCS found that overall adopting these 2 regulations would reduce NOx emissions 85% and PM 2.5 by 27%. In terms of monetary value, that adds up to $1.8 billion in health-related savings, hundreds of millions of dollars every year in net societal benefits, which are basically savings for operators and businesses, and then $7.5 billion in net societal benefits cumulatively by 2050. So we think that report makes a really strong case for adopting these 2 regulations in both of our states. So in terms of how to take action, in Massachusetts, the state has adopted both of these regulations via emergency regulation, which means they're only in place for 90 days and need to be replaced with proper regulations. And so within that 90-day period, which is where we are right now, there are opportunities for public comment. So the first is on February 1st. There is a hearing at 10 a.m. You can sign up to speak in support of these regulations. We will be there, so you can speak with us. But if you prefer to send in written comments or want to do both, you can do that by emailing written comments to the email address that's at the bottom. So I will send out instructions with all of that in the follow-up email. In Rhode Island, the situation is a little bit different. Rhode Island has not yet started the formal process for adopting ACT or HDO, but we think they should. So you can email the assistant to the Department of Environmental Management at the email address linked there to indicate that you think Rhode Island should follow Massachusetts' lead in adopting these important regulations out of California. In both states, there is absolutely value in making sure that your legislators know that this is happening and that you support this. And I want to recognize that we have a couple of Rhode Island legislators on the call. So thank you very much to Senator DeMario, Anderson, and Rep. McGaugh for joining us. We hope you learned some stuff about trucks and are as excited as we are about electrifying them. But whether you're in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, it's always worth sending a note to your legislators saying, hey, this is happening, we're speaking in support, and we think you should take note. So with that, we have reached the end of this webinar. I want to send a huge thank you again to Ezekiel and Angie for joining us and sharing their knowledge and expertise and insight. And I want to thank all of you for joining on your lunch hour to learn some stuff about trucks. I'll make sure you get the slides and the recording and some key links and emails later this week. But for now, have a lovely afternoon, and thanks for joining. Bye.